In the autumn of 1981, an archivist at the New Avalon Historical Registry uncovered a sealed case file buried in a mislabeled storage box beneath a stack of pension records. The folder, brittle and yellowed, bore a crimson wax seal with the faded insignia of the city constabulary, broken and faded with time. Inside were faded photographs, autopsy sketches, and pages typed on a Remington machine, bound in string and smelling faintly of chemicals. The file, long forgotten, detailed a series of deaths so strange, so grotesque, that even in our modern forensic era they defy explanation. But in the winter of 1886, someone tried to make sense of them. Inspector Elias Merton, then just 42, was neither famous nor beloved. He was a private man, a former battlefield surgeon turned reluctant police investigator, with no family and few friends. He kept to himself in a modest brownstone off Calverton Street, and filled his evenings with books on physiology, emerging theories of emotion, and the quieter writings of Stoic philosophers. Most in the constabulary viewed him as brilliant but distant, brilliant but difficult, too meticulous, too slow, too abstract. Yet it was Elias who was called to the residence of the Brandt family one bitter December morning when the frost had clung so fiercely to the iron railings that even the footmen wore gloves indoors. The Brandt estate on Mercier Square was a monument to old New Avalon wealth. Red brick, copper-capped turrets, and windows etched with imported stained glass. Inside, the gas lamps flickered dimly against the chilled air, casting uncertain shadows across ornate plaster ceilings. At the center of the main drawing room, beneath a painted dome and silk-draped windows, lay the body of Mrs. Viola Hemsworth. She had been the housekeeper for 28 years. Loyal, punctual, and precise, a woman who once deducted a week's wages from a maid who left a silver tray slightly askew on a tea cart. Yet there she lay, supine on the Aubusson carpet, her hands folded neatly on her chest and her face contorted into a rictus of perfect radiant laughter. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners, her mouth wide open, as though she had just heard the most delightful joke of her life. But her chest bore something no joke could explain. Carved just below the collarbone was a small theatrical mask, half comedy, half tragedy, etched with surgical precision into her skin. It had not bled much. The coroner would later determine it had been done post-mortem, but meticulously, with steady hands and an understanding of anatomy. The gas lights hissed faintly. Outside, the wind dragged leaves across the cobblestones. Elias Merton, tall and slender in his dark coat and gloves, stood still beside her body for a long time before speaking. He knelt, inhaled slowly, and then narrowed his eyes. There was a scent in the air, not the coppery tang of blood, nor the sourness of fear. This was different. Sweet, faintly metallic, with an undertone of something medicinal, ether perhaps, but with something else layered underneath. His young assistant, Constable Finine Odell, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Sir," he whispered. "Her face, it's like she's still laughing." "She isn't," Elias said, but something made her believe she was. No valuables were missing, no doors were forced, no fingerprints, no witnesses, only a smear of the same sweet-smelling residue on the doorframe and a shattered porcelain figurine near the fireplace. Lady Lucille Brandt, the mistress of the house, had discovered the body after returning from a charitable recital. She had been in tears but composed, her gloves still damp with morning frost, as she spoke. "She was always so quiet, so careful," Lucille said, "and last night before I left, she insisted on locking every door herself. She even reminded me twice about extinguishing the hallway lamps. I don't understand it." Neither did Elias. But then the widow next door, Mrs. Priscilla Fenwick, came forward later that day. Her voice trembled as she spoke over tea and crumpets in her perfectly heated salon. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," she began. "But just past 2 a.m, I heard laughter coming from the Brandt house, a woman's voice again and again. So loud it woke me. At first I thought perhaps Lady Lucille had company, but she trailed off, fingers trembling as they gripped the teacup. But, Inspector, it went on for nearly an hour. Unnatural. Joyful, yes, but relentless, like something was forcing her to laugh and she couldn't stop. Elias recorded the statement in his notebook without comment. That night, he returned to the drawing room alone, long after the constables had gone. The body had been removed, but the scent lingered faint and ghostly. He stood in silence, watching the flicker of the last gaslight as it dimmed. He did not know yet that this was the first, that by spring 7 more would follow, that a pattern would emerge perfect in its horror, deliberate in its method. But he knew even then, as the snow tapped softly against the windows and the wind crept beneath the door, that something unnatural had begun. Something that played with emotion, like a puppeteer, with string, something that laughed in the darkness. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where history hides something dreadful, consider subscribing or sharing where you're listening from. The shadows of the past often hold the darkest truths, and we're only just beginning to uncover them. In the weeks following the death of Viola Hemsworth, the frost deepened across New Avalon. The gas lamps hissed longer each evening, and the fog from the river rolled in earlier, swallowing the cobblestone streets in a haze of damp wool and coal smoke. The city, viewed from the domed roof of the constabulary, resembled a half-forgotten painting, its grandeur smudged at the edges, its light fading beneath the weight of its own pretense. Elias Merton spent those early weeks not chasing suspects, but patterns. Because something about the laughter reported again 2 nights later by a lairess on Montrose Lane gnawed at him. It was always the same. A woman's laughter, shrill but melodic, echoing in the early hours long after the presumed time of death. Always from inside a locked home, always with no other witness. And in every case, the authorities dismissed it as imagination. Grief, they said, fatigue, gas hallucination. But Elias knew better. He began to chart the social circles of the Brants and Elrigas, and what emerged was not a string of coincidences, but a tight-knit constellation of privilege, the city's industrial royalty. The families who had built New Avalon from timber, coal, and steel now ruled it from behind marble columns and imported tapestries, and they all seemed to be performing. Take the Burt, for example. Cyrus Brant, patriarch of the Steel Empire, had grown pale and reclusive since Viola's death. His wife, Lucille, now held court at charity galas and art salons where her grief had become a performance of its own. Always the delicate sigh, the distant gaze, the perfectly timed tears. The Elridges, of course, had their own veneer to maintain. Tobias Elridge, a lifelong bachelor and patron of the New Avalon Literary Society, was often seen in his carriage en route to theaters or philosophical lectures. Yet he too had withdrawn of late, and his footmen reported something strange. Tobias had taken to locking himself inside his study for hours, murmuring to himself in strange tones, sometimes laughing. Then there were the Covingtons, shipbuilding magnates whose fleet of Atlantic liners had made them unimaginably wealthy. At their most recent masquerade ball, an event attended by nearly everyone of note in the city, Elias observed something he could not unsee. The laughter. Not casual, social laughter, but sharp, sudden outbursts from various guests, as if triggered by some unseen hand. It happened 3 times, once near the buffet, once on the dance floor, and once by the grand staircase. Each time, the subject clutched their side, threw their head back, and laughed not joyfully, but compulsively, frenetically. Then, just as quickly, they stopped, smoothed their attire, smiled, and continued. It chilled Elias more than any corpse could have. Behind the city's opulent facade, something else was stirring, something that wore a smile like a mask. He began reviewing medical records, public death notices, autopsy reports the coroner's office had quietly reclassified. A curious pattern emerged. 4 deaths over the past year, each in the wealthier districts, each with vague symptoms described as cardiac arrest during emotional distress or stroke accompanied by facial rigidity. None had been investigated further. No markings, no chemical residue noted, but Elias suspected those were early trials. Then came the morning he received a letter. No name, just an address scrawled in careful script. The Grand Auditorium, St. Albans Lyceum. No explanation, only 2 words at the bottom. He watches. Elias went alone that evening, long after the theater's final curtain call. The Lyceum had once hosted Shakespearean companies and political orators. Now it struggled to fill seats with watered-down melodrama and traveling pantomimes. Inside, the velvet seats were threadbare, the walls peeled where once they gleamed, and yet the air was electric, as if the building remembered something it wasn't allowed to forget. A janitor led Elias inside, mumbling about a man who had attended every show that month, always in the same seat. Box 7. Always alone, never applauding, but always laughing. Sometimes at death scenes, sometimes at nothing at all. I stopped watching after a while, the man muttered, handing Elias a stub torn from a box office ledger. Gives me the creeps. Elias sat in box 7. The view of the stage was perfect, centered, elevated, but more than that, it was intimate. From here, you could see the actors' eyes, their strain, their pretense, and you could see when they broke character just slightly, just enough to glimpse the person beneath the role. That's when Elias began to understand. These deaths weren't murders, they were performances, rehearsals for something larger, something grotesque and deliberate. The following week brought snow, thick and wet, coating the iron fences and horse carts in pale velvet, and with it came another death. Elias stood in the study of Tobias Elridge, now cold and still. The body had been found by his valet, seated in an armchair near the hearth. A fire still smoldered in the grate. Tobias wore a wine-colored dressing robe, his head tilted slightly back, a small book fallen open in his lap. His expression was once again radiant with laughter, mouth agape, eyes crinkled. The same as Viola, the same as the others. But here the room was untouched. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, no evidence save for a faint trace of that same sweet, cloying scent. Elias picked up the book from Tobias's lap, a volume of essays. On the open page, a phrase was underlined in dark ink. Authentic joy cannot be summoned. It must be revealed. It wasn't a random quote. It was a thesis. Tobias had volunteered for this, or worse, he had believed in it. Elias turned, gazing at the bookshelves that lined the room, noticing a loose panel in the corner. Behind it, a diary bound in red leather, Tobias's own handwriting, careful and precise. Pages filled with references to emotional purity, chemical liberation, and a name, Dr. S. Kettering. The entries were meticulous, clinical. Tobias had met Dr. Kettering months before, after a private lecture on neurochemical triggers of laughter. The doctor had offered him an opportunity to explore joy, freed from social conditioning. It was framed as science, as art, as transcendence. Elias closed the diary with steady hands. The second death had confirmed it, but it also meant this was no longer a series of crimes. It was a doctrine, and New Avalon, in all its gilded glamour, was merely the stage. The snow had turned to ice by the time Elias Merton stepped out from the Elridge residence, the cobblestones slick beneath his boots. Overhead, the gas lamps flickered against the wind like dying stars, and the city seemed to hold its breath. In his coat pocket, the red-bound diary throbbed with meaning heavier than its weight should allow. Dr. S. Kettering. The name meant nothing at first. No records in the city's physician registry, no office listed in the Gazette, and yet the entries in Tobias Elridge's journal spoke of him as a man of some reputation in esoteric circles, a former lecturer, a theorist on emotion. And if the notes were to be believed, a man convinced that modern society had stripped humanity of its ability to feel anything truly unless forcibly reawakened. Elias knew where to start looking. A modest curiosity shop on Lavellin Street, known simply as the Anam, had long catered to the city's more obscure intellectuals. Its proprietor, Mr. Clangon, Darren Hull, was a thin man with a clockmaker's hands and the wide eyes of someone who had read too many forbidden books and not enough poetry. "I've heard the name," he said, not meeting Elias's gaze. Years ago he gave talks, unlisted lectures, invite only. They'd hold them upstairs at the Moorgrave Society Club. Not public, not legal. You didn't hear that from me. What kind of lectures? Emotion, Hull said, but not like you'd expect. He said laughter wasn't happiness. that grief wasn't sadness, that everything we felt was performance, that we were all pretending, and the only real feelings were the ones we didn't choose. And he offered to make people feel again. Howell Not at Once said he'd found the chemical keys to unlock authentic joy. The Moorgrave Society Club was housed in an old carriage house tucked behind an abandoned bank, now operating only at night. Elias had passed it many times without thinking. It was unremarkable from the outside, smoked glass, green shutters, but that evening he stepped inside with purpose. A bar, dimly lit. Men in tailored coats and women in high collars sat in circles of hushed conversation, pipes burning, hands stirring brandy. It smelled of old wood, tobacco, and philosophy. He showed the barkeep Tobias Elg's card. The man glanced once, then nodded toward a narrow staircase in the back. "Library," he said. The library was quiet. Oil lamps lined the walls, casting a warm glow over shelves crowded with books that bore no titles, only symbols or blank leather spines. A fire burned low in the hearth, and at its center sat an older man hunched in a velvet chair, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness. He looked up. Elias recognized him not from any photograph, but from the descriptions. Sharp nose, pallid skin, and eyes like dull glass. A man who observed more than he expressed. "You're looking for Dr. Kettering," the man said. "I am. He doesn't lecture anymore. I know, 2 of his subjects are dead." The man's mouth twitched, not in surprise, but recognition. "Then you've come late." He introduced himself as Professor Vive, once a colleague of Kettering's during their time at the New Avalon Medical Institute. He spoke with precision, carefully selecting each word as though dissecting them in midair. Dr. Kettering was a pioneer. V said he believed that the human experience had become artificial, that manners, etiquette, even language itself were layers obscuring the authentic mind. He theorized that by suppressing social cues, one could access the raw emotional substrate. "And how?" Elias asked. "Did he propose doing that?" V gestured to the fireplace. Through chemistry, he explained. Kettering had developed a series of compounds, lacrimine, euphorotine, panic-tide, each designed to suppress certain brain functions while amplifying others. The goal was not hallucination, but clarity, to make someone laugh not because of a joke, but because the chemicals had torn away everything that told them not to. The mask carvings, the laughter after death, the frozen expressions, it all matched. Kettering believed, V said, that joy, when truly unfiltered, is indistinguishable from madness. He sought to prove it. Elias leaned forward. And his experiments? At first, willing students, actors, but then the doses changed. The volunteers stopped coming back. Elias stood. "Where is he now?" V shrugged. "He doesn't stay in one place, but last I heard he was frequenting the older music halls, listening to people laugh, studying it." As Elias turned to leave, the professor added one final word. "He thinks he's helping." Back at the constabulary, Elias locked himself in his office and spread everything across his desk: maps, case files, newspaper clippings. He traced lines between victims, locations, patterns. There was no logic to it at first, only instinct. But then he saw it, a spiral. The deaths formed a pattern radiating out from the city's heart. Each incident lay farther from the center than the last, as if Kettering were drawing something, a shape, a performance map, a ritual. And then that night, the 3rd victim was found. Alistair Grong, a playwright and social critic, was discovered seated at his writing desk, quill still in hand, a letter unfinished. He had died smiling. But beside him was something new, a playbill dated for next week, a production at the Adelbridge Theater, a place closed for over a year. The title, The Final Expression, a Performance of Joy. Elias read it once, then twice. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The Adelbridge Theater sat silent beneath a veil of soot and time. Once the jewel of New Avalon's stage scene, its grand neoclassical facade was now chipped and faded. The marble columns were blackened by factory smoke, its windows like dead eyes peering out onto the frozen street. By all records, it had closed 18 months earlier after a fire had damaged the backstage rigging. Since then, it had been dormant. No performances, no visitors, no bills posted on its crumbling marquee. And yet Elias now held a playbill in his hands bearing the Adelbridge name and a performance date just 5 days away. The final expression, a performance of joy, a one-night engagement, limited audience, private seating only. There were no cast members listed, no playwright, no producer, only a crest, 2 interlocking masks, one laughing, one weeping. The same emblem carved into the skin of Viola Hemsworth. The same symbol that had followed Elias like a shadow. He went alone. It was just past midnight when he arrived at the theater. The city behind him had gone to sleep beneath its mantle of ice. The wind sliced through the empty streets, carrying with it faint whispers that might have been distant carriages, or might have been something else entirely. The main doors were chained shut, but the alleyway stage entrance was not. It creaked open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and cold. Elias stepped carefully through the backstage corridor, his boots echoing on warped floorboards, his lantern throwing trembling shadows on the peeling wallpaper and faded posters. He passed the dressing rooms, doors ajar, mirrors cracked, makeup tins still open like frozen timepieces. The main stage loomed ahead like the hull of a great ship. The red velvet curtains, long since faded to brown, hung like mourning shrouds. The orchestra pit yawned open below, empty of musicians, but not of presence. Elias climbed onto the stage. There, under the weak moonlight filtered through the broken ceiling dome, he saw it. A chair, a spotlight, a script. The chair sat center stage facing the audience of empty seats. The spotlight wasn't lit, but a gas rig had been prepared. Wires ran from it to a valve at the side of the proscenium. Someone had been rehearsing. Elias approached the script. It lay open on a music stand. The pages were handwritten. Each line of dialogue addressed the subject. Each stage direction described emotional states. At this point, subject begins to laugh. The laughter must be pure. It must overpower him. He must forget himself. And then below, another line in a different hand. We are not performers. We are the audience of truth. Elias turned at the sound of footsteps. There was no one there, but the stage smelled faintly of something sharp and sweet. That same chemical bouquet he traced from the first crime scene. It clung to the curtains, to the floorboards, to the chair. He crouched, examining the armrests. Scratch marks, fingernails. Whoever had sat here had struggled, and yet there were no ropes, no restraints. They'd come willingly into a play they didn't understand. Back in his apartment, Elias pored over the script under the steady glow of his desk lamp. The language became increasingly abstract as it progressed, more like a scientific protocol than a dramatic work. Phrases like induction threshold, neurological decoupling, and limbic override were scrawled in the margins. This wasn't art, it was engineering, a blueprint for emotional deconstruction. And then near the end of the script, something terrifying, a list of names. Viola Hemsworth, Tobias Elridge, Alistair Grong, Cecily Bain, Lucille Brandt, Elias Merton. His name was the last, scrawled not in ink but in something darker, rusty, flaked. He stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow. He wasn't just investigating the performance. He was part of the cast. The next morning, he returned to the city archives. It was time to find out who Dr. Silas Kettering really was. The records were sparse, a brief mention in an 1879 symposium on cognitive repression and modern morality. A paper in a defunct medical journal titled On the Distortion of Emotional Purity in Industrial Societies. And then dismissal, a revocation of license by the Medical Review Board for unauthorized experimentation on psychiatric patients without consent. The reason listed, non-lethal manipulation of effective response. But there was something else, a copy of the minutes from a lecture Kettering had given unofficially at the Royal Hall of Inquiry before it had been shut down for excessive deviation from scientific orthodoxy. It was titled simply, The Society of Joy, Toward a Pure Science of Feeling. The final paragraph chilled Elias to his marrow. What use is a civilization that teaches us to smile for photographs but not for beauty? What value has a tear shed for a performer but not for ourselves? We have become numb to the real, lost in performance. I will find what is true again, even if I must burn away every mask. The page was unsigned, but someone had scrawled in the margin, "Later." Perhaps another researcher, or perhaps someone who had witnessed the lecture. He no longer wants to observe, he wants to direct. Elias leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This was no longer about solving murders, this was about stopping a production, one written in blood and not yet finished. The snow had hardened into a brittle crust across the streets of New Avalon. Even the rats avoided the alleys. Now, their prints frozen mid-scurry, their paths as interrupted as the lives of those who had vanished. Elias Merton sat motionless on the tramline bench, staring across St. Hildegard's Square at a house he'd never been inside. But that had appeared again and again in the margins of reports, letters, and whispered conversations. Cecily Vane. She'd been listed fourth in the script Elias found at the Attlebridge Theater. But unlike the others, she was still alive, a widow of comfortable means. She lived alone in a 3-story brownstone with bay windows and ironwork balconies that overlooked the square. According to old social records, her late husband had been a judge, a cold man by reputation, and Cecily had inherited not only his fortune, but his silence. She rarely attended parties, refused interviews, but a constable's note from 6 weeks prior mentioned her by name. Mrs. Vane had requested patrol near her residence, reporting a man watching her from across the street, well-dressed, never approaching, always gone by the time anyone arrived. Elias approached her door with care. The knocker was brass and shaped like a laughing mask, one of those old theater motifs. He hesitated a moment before striking it twice. Footsteps, a pause. Then the door creaked open. Cecily Vane was younger than he expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with silver already in her hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from long years of being too careful. Her eyes scanned Elias with a scholar's discipline. "I know who you are," she said. "I suspect you do," he replied. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The drawing room was orderly, warm, the fire already lit. A tea set waited on the tray, untouched, as if expecting a guest who never arrived. Elias remained standing. "You've seen him," he said. Cecily didn't blink. He stood beneath the lamp outside that theater across the square. Every evening, same time, same place. He never moved. Not until I blinked. "Describe him." She turned slightly toward the window. "He wears evening clothes, gloves, no hat, and he smiles. But not like someone who's amused. It's detached, like he's watching a performance only he understands." Elias swallowed. "Did he ever approach?" "No, but he left something in my mailbox." She walked across the room and returned with a folded sheet of heavy parchment. It was another page from the script, typed in the same monospaced font. Stage directions. Subject fee shall be observed nightly to monitor emotional thresholds. She responds well to isolation, subtle dread, direct exposure to compound A scheduled for Thursday next. Below that, handwritten in dark ink, no masks left to wear. Elias set the paper down. "That was last Thursday." She nodded. "Have you noticed anything since?" Her eyes flicked upward. "I've started to laugh." He felt his stomach turn. It began softly. In the mornings, while making tea, then again while undressing for bed. It wasn't me. It sounded wrong, as if someone else was using my voice. He sat now. "Miss Vane, has anyone entered this house without your knowledge?" She hesitated. "Not that I can prove, but one book was missing from my shelf." A volume of monologues, and there was a scent in the air yesterday morning, sweet, like violets mixed with something metallic. The chemical. Elias stood abruptly. "You're not safe here. I wasn't safe the moment I attended that lecture," she said quietly. He saw me. The moment I laughed, he turned to her sharply. "You attended Kataring's lecture 3 years ago. It was billed as a talk on theater and neurology. I thought it might help me reconnect with something." My husband had just passed. I hadn't laughed in months. When Kataring spoke, it felt like he saw through all of us, said we weren't grieving. We were performing grief. Her hands were trembling now. I believed him. Elias approached the window and stared out across the square. No figure under the lamp, only frost curling along the glass. "He's picking you off one by one," Elias murmured, choosing the curious, the lonely, those who were open enough to listen. He didn't say it, but he knew the truth. They'd all been part of the same audience, and now, one by one, they were being called back to the stage. Cecily watched him, her voice suddenly low. "Inspector, if he's doing this for some kind of experiment, why all the theater? Why the drama?" Elias turned back to her. "Because he doesn't see it as murder, he sees it as performance." And then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the door. Elias drew his revolver instantly. Cecily froze. He crossed the floor silently, boots soft on the carpet, and approached the peephole. The street was empty. He opened the door, and there on the doorstep lay a parcel wrapped in oilskin. Inside, a mask, hand-carved, split down the middle, one side comedy, the other tragedy. Pinned to it was a single line typed on cream paper. "Your cue approaches. Rehearse well." Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat in the drawing room of Cecily Bain's home, the fire dying to embers behind him, the carved mask resting like a loaded weapon on the side table. Across from him, Cecily curled in her chair, the tremor in her hands now more pronounced, her eyes refusing to close. "I can feel it," she whispered. "Something in me is shifting." He had seen it before, soldiers in the infirmary after chemical exposure, blinking through hallucinations, half laughing at wounds they didn't yet realize would kill them. This was no different. Whatever Dr. Kompar Kitaring had released into Cecily's world, it was working. Her smile kept surfacing involuntarily, small at first, then lingering. Elias gave her laudanum enough to let her rest, not enough to cloud her mind, and instructed her housemaid not to let anyone through the door, not even uniformed officers, unless Elias himself returned with them. Then he left, stepping into the frost-choked dawn with the mask in his coat pocket, his boots crunching over the ice like breaking glass. Lucille Brandt was next, the widow of industrialist Cyrus Brandt. Lucille had once hosted the most elaborate salons in New Avalon. Her name had appeared in every social registry. Her opinions echoed through the city's literary reviews and cultural circles. But since her husband's death last summer, she had vanished from public life. Elias had tried reaching out to her twice before. Both attempts were met with silence. Now, with 2 names left on the list and Cecily beginning to unravel, there was no time left for diplomacy. He arrived at the Brandt residence near mid-morning. The household staff, reduced to 2 footmen and a groundskeeper, were reluctant to let him in. It was only when he showed them the carved mask that one of them, an older man named Isaac, lowered his eyes and stepped aside. "She doesn't speak much anymore," Isaac murmured as he led Elias down the silent marble hallway. "Sits in the music room most days, doesn't touch the piano, just listens to." Isaac's voice dropped. "Sometimes it sounds like laughter, but it ain't hers." Lucille Brandt sat by the tall windows, her figure draped in black, hands folded in her lap. She didn't turn when Elias entered. She only spoke once he stepped fully into the light of the room. "You're late." He blinked. "You expected me?" "I've been expecting someone. I wasn't sure if it would be you or him." She finally turned her head. Her face was pale, hollowed, not with age, but with something Elias had come to recognize, the expression of someone who had seen more than she had ever wanted to. "I saw Tobias the week before he died," she said. "He gave me something." She reached into a drawer and retrieved a small glass vial sealed with wax. Inside was a clear, shimmering liquid. "He said it would let me feel again, that it would wash away the rehearsals, leave only the truth." Elias took the vial carefully. The wax seal bore the faint imprint of a theater mask. He slipped it into his pocket beside the carved one. "Did you take it?" he asked. Lucille's smile was faint. "Not yet. I was waiting to see what happened to the others." Her gaze turned toward the frost-covered garden beyond the glass. "But it doesn't matter. He's already decided. I heard his footsteps 2 nights ago on the balcony. I watched my own breath fog on the glass, and his did not." She turned back. "I think he's beyond breathing." Elias crouched before her. "Mrs. Brandt, I need to know what happened at that lecture, the one with Kettering. She exhaled slowly. He told us we were chosen, that our lives had been too curated, too civilized, that the world had sanded off our edges. He said we no longer felt anything, only performed the memory of feeling. He called it emotional taxidermy. Elias swallowed. He promised to tear away the skin of performance, she continued, to reveal what was real underneath. And the terrifying part is I believed him. We all did. Elias stood, his voice low. I think he's preparing a final act. One that involves everyone who ever listened to him. Lucille looked down at her hands. Then you'll need to find the conductor. He furrowed his brow. The what? She reached into a small side table and withdrew a faded program. It was older than the Adelbridge script, dated 2 years prior, a private performance at the now-defunct Palmerston Society, an exclusive intellectual circle of artists, doctors, and financiers. The program read, The Conductor of Emotion, Dr. S. Kettering, one night only. Elias stared at the names listed as attendees. All of them were dead except 3. Lucille Brandt, Cecily Bain, and himself. He didn't remember attending. But then again, not all performances are remembered, especially when you're not in the audience. You're on the stage. There is a moment of flicker when the investigator becomes the investigated. Elias Merton felt it that evening, alone in his study, surrounded by documents that no longer seemed to accuse others, but whispered toward him instead. The fire hissed. Shadows curled against the corners of the room, and on his desk the program from the Palmerston Society sat open like a confession he didn't remember writing. The Conductor of Emotion, Private Lecture Demonstration, October 9th, 1884. Attendees by invitation only. His name wasn't listed, but in the margins, in the same clean script used throughout every artifact tied to Dr. Kettering. Someone had scrawled. He was there. He just wasn't watching. That line repeated itself in Elias's thoughts for hours. He no longer trusted what he remembered. He no longer trusted what he didn't. His own case notes written in his precise hand had strange inconsistencies, dates with small redirections, witness names crossed out and rewritten in ink slightly different than his usual blend. There were 3 days in October 1884, right around the date of the Palmerston event, where no journal entry existed. His pocket notebook, normally meticulous, jumped directly from the 8th to the 12th. 3 missing days. He checked hospital records under the pretense of reviewing an unrelated case. There in the New Avalon General Registry, he found a single note from October 10th, 1884. Patient Elias Merton brought in by City Patrol after being found wandering near the docks. Disoriented, no injuries, declined overnight stay, released same evening. Attending physician, Dr. A. Wallen. Elias had no memory of it, no memory of anything between the 8th and 12th. He stared at the entry until the ink blurred. He had always assumed the others were victims because they had attended Kettering's lectures. But what if some had been drawn in deeper, not as observers, but as participants? Had he already been injected, observed, measured, and if so, what had he done? He needed answers, and there was only one man who might still have them, Dr. Amos Wallen, a reclusive neurologist who had left public practice years ago after a series of disputes over experimental methodology. But he was still alive, living in self-imposed exile in the hills north of the city, tending to a private library and what remained of his conscience. Elias took the overnight train, arriving at Wallen's estate just past dawn. The man who greeted him was older now, with deep-set eyes and a cautious voice. But the name Merton seemed to awaken something in him, a memory flickering back to life. "You're not the first to come looking," Wallen said as he poured tea with a trembling hand. "But you are the first to ask directly." "I need to know what happened to me," Elias said. Wallen stared at the fire for a long moment before answering. "You were brought in by 2 patrolmen, dressed well but disoriented, pupils dilated, sweating, laughing one moment, muttering the next, but no signs of trauma, no alcohol, no opium, just confusion." "Did I say where I'd been?" Elias asked. "No. Wallen said, but you kept repeating a phrase. Elias leaned forward. The script's not finished. He needs a better ending. The words fell over him like cold water. Wallen continued. You refused rest, insisted on leaving before midnight, said you had to be back before the curtain dropped. I thought it was nonsense, a breakdown, but I've never forgotten your eyes. What about afterward? Elias asked. Did anyone else inquire about me? Wallen nodded. 3 days later, a gentleman came asking for your file, well-dressed academic. I refused. He left nothing behind except this. Wallen rose and returned with a letter. The envelope was sealed with the same laughing tragedy mask. Inside was a single sheet. Elias is not the audience. He is the echo. Watch what happens when he begins to remember. No signature. Elias left the estate in silence. He returned to the city before nightfall, but he no longer walked the streets like a man searching for clues. Now he walked like someone being followed by his own shadow. At home, he examined the vial Cecily had given him. The shimmering liquid caught the firelight like a captive star. He uncorked it and dipped a sliver of cloth in. The scent was unmistakable, sweet, violet-laced, undercut with a metallic tang. This was the substance, the one that made the dead smile. He placed the cloth beneath a glass dome and opened his copy of The Anatomy of Affect, a banned volume he'd confiscated years earlier. Inside were illustrations of facial musculature, notes on involuntary expression. He compared them to the morgue sketches of Viola Hemsworth and Tobias Elridge. The muscular contractions matched not the body's natural expression of joy, but a chemically induced simulation. Laughter without stimulus, joy without source. And suddenly he understood. Kettering's work wasn't about emotion. It was about authenticity, stripping away everything artificial until nothing remained but the raw, reflexive core. The laughter wasn't the goal. It was the symptom of a deeper rupture. That night, as Elias tried to sleep, he heard something beneath his window. A rustle, a whisper, and then 3 soft knocks. Not at the door, at the glass. He rose, revolver in hand, and drew back the curtain. No one was there, only a piece of paper pinned to the sill with a brass tack. It begins again. Curtain rises in 3 nights. You already know your lines. The city no longer looked the same. New Avalon, once etched in straight lines and iron lamplight, had begun to blur at the edges. Not with fog, but with meaning. Every alley seemed narrower, every passerby less distinct, and Elias Merton, for all his years spent observing others, now found himself the one being studied. He walked faster. Each tick of his pocket watch echoed like a stage cue. 3 nights. That was what the message said, and he believed it. Everything had led here. Not just the deaths, the masks, the letters, but his own memory, or rather, the holes in it. Whatever Kettering had started, it wasn't over. The final act had been written, and Elias suspected it had been written for him long ago, which meant he had only one place left to go. The Palmerstone Society, once an exclusive gathering of intellectuals, had fallen into disrepute after an anonymous exposé revealed that many of its philosophical demonstrations bordered on medical illegality. It had been shuttered swiftly, its members scattered, its building locked, but Elias still had contacts. By nightfall, he stood at the wrought iron gate of the old mansion, its gargoyle-lined roof now crumbling, ivy strangling the stone like veins beneath a corpse's skin. He pried open a rusted side door and stepped inside. The interior had been untouched since its closure. Dust blanketed every surface like ash. Portraits of forgotten thinkers stared down with blank expressions. A grand chandelier hung above the central foyer, its crystals dim with age. Elias moved with purpose. He wasn't there to explore, he was there to remember. Room by room, he traced the architecture until he reached a library on the 3rd floor. As he stepped through the doorway, something shifted, a sensation strange but not unfamiliar. The scent, that same faint sweetness. Violets, ether, copper, and in the center of the room, beneath a sheet, was a chair. He pulled the cloth away. It was the same chair he had seen on the stage at the Attlebridge Theater. Carved arms, claw feet, upholstered in faded red velvet. But it wasn't alone. Beside it stood a tall mirror framed in black lacquer. And behind the mirror, another chair facing him, facing the mirror, facing himself. Elias sat. The moment he did, a strange pressure built in his ears. A memory surged, disjointed but potent. Flashes of a stage, warm lights, faces watching from the dark, and his own voice laughing. No words, just laughter. Uncontrolled, he staggered back up, breath ragged. Someone had conducted a rehearsal here. He was beginning to remember it. On the wall beside the fireplace, he noticed a cabinet built into the brick. Inside were vials, sealed and labeled in Kataring's precise hand. Compound A, joy. Compound B, dread. Compound C, silence. Each label was followed by an initial, not just for the compound, but for the subject, a VHBTECEM alias, his initials. He reached further in and pulled out a thin black notebook. On the cover, performance notes, Marin. Gurov. The pages inside were a grotesque archive of his own physiology. Subject demonstrated delayed emotional response at initial dosage. Laughter began 7.2 minutes after administration. Vocalization erratic. Facial expression held beyond expected window suggests potential for deeper effective rupture under strain. Rehearsal continues. He stopped reading. These weren't notes on a test subject, they were notes on an actor. He was part of the production. He hadn't been chasing the murderer. He had been moving through his own third act. Suddenly something shifted behind him, a reflection in the mirror, a figure. Elias turned sharply, but the chair across from him was empty. Only the mirror held the shape of a man seated there, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture unmistakable, upright, composed, as if waiting for a cue. Then, from behind the glass, a voice, warm, calm, familiar. "You've come far, Elias, but the audience is growing impatient." Elias didn't move. The voice continued. "You were always meant to return here. Your laughter. Do you remember it now? It was beautiful, unrestrained. You were the first to break." He stepped closer to the mirror. "I'm not finished," Elias whispered. "Of course not," the voice replied. "But you're not writing the ending. You never were." Then the lights in the room flared and went out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. When Elias lit his lantern again, the mirror was cracked. The chair was gone. So were the vials. Only one thing remained, a slip of paper on the floor, typed in the familiar font. "Curtain rises tomorrow. Your audience awaits." The next day passed like the quiet before an execution. Elias Merton spoke to no one, ate nothing, slept not at all. He sat in his flat on Calverton Street, coat still on, revolver cleaned and loaded. The cracked mirror from the Palmerston Library laid across his table like a fractured version of himself. The slip of paper was beside it, its typed message burning in his brain. "Curtain rises tomorrow. Your audience awaits." It was no longer a metaphor. The performance, whatever grotesque form it would take, was scheduled. He knew the place, the Attlebridge Theater. He knew the players, Cecily Bain, Lucille Brandt, perhaps even others who had never made it onto his list. But most of all, he knew the director, Dr. Silas Kettering. He could no longer think of him as a killer. That word seemed too pedestrian. Now, Kettering was an author, a conductor of emotion, a playwright of pathology, and Elias, despite everything, was no longer sure whether he was the detective chasing him or the subject he had been building toward from the very beginning. Even now, the memory fragments stirred just beneath the surface. Smiles that weren't his, laughter that rose unbidden, phrases he couldn't remember saying but heard in his own voice. "You were the first to break," the voice in the mirror had said. What had Kettering seen in him back then? A man alone, rigid in his routines, untouched by love or loss, a perfect specimen of emotional control, until the moment it cracked. By the time night arrived, Elias had made his decision. He would not run. He would not sabotage the stage. He would attend. He left behind 3 sealed letters, one to Cecily Vane, should she survive, one to the constabulary's chief, and one with no address, only a title scrawled on the envelope in shaky ink, "In case I forget again." Then he dressed carefully, not in uniform, not in morning black, but in formal evening attire, waistcoat, gloves, cravat. He looked into his own reflection and did not recognize the man looking back. That felt appropriate. The streets were empty as he walked. The fog hung low, hissing around the gas lamps like something alive. Horses' hooves echoed distantly on brick, but no carriages passed him. Time itself seemed to retreat, and then the Adelbridge Theatre appeared, lit, its grand doors wide open. Lanterns burned along the awnings. The ticket booth was manned, though the woman inside didn't speak, only handed him a single black slip embossed with silver ink. No price, no seat number. Only 3 words, the final expression, admit one. Inside, the lobby glowed with gaslight. Dozens of people moved quietly through the space, all dressed for the occasion. Elias recognized faces not from life, but from portraits, from death records, from memory. Viola Hemsworth, Tobias Elridge, Alistair Grange, standing, smiling, alive, except not quite. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy. They didn't blink, and when he looked again, they were gone. He pushed through the velvet curtains. The theater was full, every seat occupied, but no one moved. They sat as if frozen in place, breathing perhaps, but not shifting, not whispering, not blinking. A sea of mannequins carved from memory. The gaslights dimmed. The stage curtain rose. From the wings stepped Dr. Silas Kettering. He looked precisely as Elias remembered him, unchanged, not aged. Dressed in formal black, white gloves, a subtle smile playing beneath his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing not just through the theater, but through Elias's bones. "It brings me joy, true joy, to see you again, Elias." No one else in the audience reacted. Elias remained standing in the aisle. "You invited me," he said. "I wrote you," Kettering corrected. "You invited yourself long before that, when you chose to remember." He gestured toward the stage. "The chair is ready." Elias hesitated. Kettering's smile widened. "You came to witness. But Elias, you never were the witness. You were the echo, the resonance, the one whose laughter lasted longer." Elias reached into his coat, hand on the revolver. Kettering noticed and gently shook his head. "No need for violence. You've already performed beautifully. This is simply your final line." From the shadows, stage hands emerged silent, dressed in black, faces obscured. They carried something long and draped, a mirror framed in onyx. They placed it center stage, and in it Elias saw not himself, but a version of himself. Eyes wide, laughing uncontrollably, mouth stretched in rapture. The memory hit like a tidal wave. He had sat in that chair. He had laughed. He had begged to stop, and they had written it all down. He stumbled back. "No," he whispered. Kettering stepped forward. "Elias, this is the moment of purity, the moment where performance ends. We will remove the last mask." He extended a gloved hand. "Join me." Elias stared at it, and slowly he reached for the chair. The chair felt warm. That was the first surprise. Not cold like stone or metal, not indifferent like an object of torture, but warm as if someone had just left it, as if someone somewhere was keeping it ready for him all this time. Elias Marin sat, hands resting on the worn velvet arms, and looked out at the audience. They did not blink. 1,000 eyes, glassy and fixed, stared back, but not with anticipation, with stillness, like portraits, like ghosts, waiting to see if their story would finally make sense. Dr. Silas Kettering circled him slowly. "Do you remember it now?" he asked gently. Elias said nothing. Kettering paused at center stage, holding the vial aloft. It shimmered under the calcium light, clear, perfect, like water on the verge of boiling. "The final iteration," Kettering announced, "refined from their errors, balanced for duration, not excess, no side effects, no trauma, only truth, only truth." He approached Elias, uncorking the vial with a soft pop. The scent unfurled instantly. Violets, alcohol, and something ancient. Elias spoke at last. "I know what you're doing." Kettering tilted his head. "You think this is science," Elias continued, "that you're peeling back artifice to find something real beneath. But there's nothing pure under the surface. Emotion isn't truth. It's context. It's memory. It's humanity." Kettering's smile did not waver. "You're afraid?" "I'm alive." Silence. Then Kettering leaned closer. "And yet you came back to the chair." He raised the vial, but Elias moved faster. In one swift motion, he knocked the glass from Kettering's hand, sending it spinning into the orchestra pit, where it shattered with a sound like snapping bone. The scent flooded the air, but diluted. Unfocused, the audience began to stir. Elias stood. No more rehearsals. Kataring's smile dropped for the first time. "You still don't understand," he said quietly. "There is no audience. There never was. These are not spectators. These are echoes, memories. You've been performing for yourself this entire time." Elias stepped toward him. "And what are you then?" Kataring opened his mouth to answer, but behind him the mirror flickered. Elias turned. Reflected in the glass was not just the stage. It was him standing, laughing. Not now, but then. The memory. The first performance was playing inside the glass. A younger Elias strapped to the chair, smiling in rapture as the compound took hold, his eyes wide with something between terror and joy. It had all been recorded, not in sound, not in ink, but in emotion, stored, replayed, perfected. Kataring spoke softly. "Each performance leaves an impression, not on the stage, on the self. We've watched you relive it over and over, always resisting, always returning." Elias stepped back from the mirror. "This isn't science," Kataring nodded. "No, it's theater." And with that, the audience rose to their feet in unison. Hundreds of bodies, not clapping, not smiling, just rising, breathing, waiting. Cecily Vane was among them. So was Lucille Brandt. Their faces no longer frozen but solemn, awake, eyes locked on Elias as if urging him to end it. He looked back at Kettering. "You never cared about joy. I cared only for what was beneath it. And what did you find?" Kataring's smile returned. "You." Elias didn't hesitate. He drew the second vial, the one he had taken from Lucille's house, and smashed it at his own feet. The vapor rose instantly, sharp and silver. Kataring staggered back, eyes watering, but stood in it, breathing deeply, and nothing happened. No laughter, no visions, only clarity. Kettering gasped. "You neutralized it." "I understood it," Elias said. "That's what you never counted on. Emotion isn't a formula, it's choice." The mirror shattered. The light above exploded in sparks, and the audience, as one, collapsed back into their seats, unmoving like puppets with strings severed. Kataring fell to his knees. "You've ruined it." "No." Elias stepped toward him. "I've ended it." He turned away, leaving the broken mirror, the empty chair, and the man who had orchestrated it all, kneeling in silence. As he stepped into the lobby, the gaslights flared once, then extinguished. The curtain had fallen. 3 days passed. The Attlebridge Theater stood silent once more. Its facade darkened, its doors chained. But behind those heavy red curtains, the air still clung to a scent no wind could carry away, violence and regret. Elias Merton filed no report. There was no official inquiry, no arrests, no trial, because as far as the city was concerned, nothing had happened. Not a single name from the guest list appeared in hospital records or mortuary logs. No obituaries were printed, no notices posted. The people who had filled that theater, Cecily, Lucille, the others, had simply vanished, and Elias was left alone, adrift in a city that hummed with normality, unaware that it had nearly applauded its own unmaking. He spent the first morning after the performance seated at his desk, reading and rereading the letter he had written to himself. If you're reading this, it means you've survived. But be warned, memory can be more dangerous than any poison. If you feel clarity returning, resist the urge to chase it. You don't need the whole truth. You only need to stay ahead of the script. He folded it and set it aside, but he could feel it already. The pull. The theater hadn't just been the final act of Kettaring's play. It had been a trapdoor leading deeper into something far older than Elias had suspected. Because the files he found buried beneath the Palmerston Society archives weren't just about Kettering. They were about the others. Names he didn't recognize, dates that reached back decades, formulas that predated modern pharmacology, sketches of emotional anatomy drawn by hand in journals from the 1830s, long before Silas Kettering was even born. The Society of Joy wasn't just his creation. He had inherited it, and someone had funded it. One name appeared repeatedly in the ledger books of the Palmerston Vault, buried beneath layers of pseudonyms and coded transactions. R.D. Elias spent a week chasing dead ends through university registries, theater donation lists, and private medical endowments. Then, in a quiet, dust-choked room at the new Avalon Historical Library, he found it. A trust established in 1867 by a man named Reynard Dorsey, philanthropist, orator, devout patron of moral experimentation. But Dorsey had died in 1871, or so the records claimed. A painting in the archives dated 1870 depicted Dorsey standing beside a young pupil. No name, but the resemblance was undeniable. It was Kettering, barely 20, which meant Silas had been under Dorsey's wing at the very beginning, which meant he had never worked alone. That night, Elias returned home to find his apartment door ajar. He entered slowly. No sign of forced entry, no missing items, only a single envelope on his writing desk. Inside a black and white, grainy photograph, taken from a high angle, perhaps from a balcony, Elias sat in a chair on the Attlebridge stage. Standing behind him was not Kettering, but a second figure, face obscured, gloved hands resting on Elias's shoulders. Behind them, an audience of blurred faces stared forward, all smiling. On the back of the photograph, typed in perfect script, were the words, "There are still rehearsals. Your role is not complete. We look forward to your return." The name Reynard Dorsey lingered in Elias's mind like an echo from a room he hadn't realized he'd been living in. He should have known. Of course, it hadn't started with Kettering. Of course, there had been others before him. Cults don't appear from nothing. Movements aren't born, they're inherited. But it wasn't just the past Elias feared. It was the continuation. He stared at the photograph again, his own image, seated in that chair. What chilled him wasn't only the sight of himself, but the composition, the framing. It looked rehearsed, like a production still from a play yet to premiere. The figure behind him, tall, gloved, with features just out of frame, was not Kettering. And that meant only one thing. Someone else had been directing. By mid-morning, Elias had traced the last known holdings of Reynard Dorsey to an old estate on the edge of the city, Wick House, a sprawling property once used as a convalescent home for those unmoored by grief. The city had repossessed it after Dorsey's reported death in 1871, then leased it to a series of failed medical programs until it was abandoned entirely. Now, it stood empty. Officially. Unofficially, it was very much alive. Elias arrived just after dusk. The building was surrounded by black iron gates, vines choking the railings. The name Hearthwick was barely visible on the cracked stone arch. The windows were boarded, but candlelight flickered faintly behind the second-story glass. He climbed the side fence and entered through the back. Inside, the air was warm, too warm for a place so dead. And beneath the scent of dust and rot, Elias caught something else. Violets. He moved silently through narrow corridors lined with rusted lanterns and old portraits. Unlike the Palmerston Library or the Attlebridge stage, this place didn't perform secrecy. It radiated it. As he turned a corner, voices floated toward him. Not words, just tones. Children's voices. Soft, rehearsed, laughing. Elias froze. The sound came from a chamber at the end of the hall, where double doors had been left slightly ajar. He approached carefully and peered through the crack. What he saw made him forget to breathe. Inside was a circular room lit by gaslight chandeliers. Along the walls, 12 children, none older than 12, stood in a perfect ring, each holding a theater mask in one hand, the other hand placed over their hearts. At the center of the circle stood a tall figure in a long, dark coat, face hidden, gloved hands moving slowly as if conducting an orchestra. The children began to laugh in unison, softly at first, then louder, then violently, but their faces never changed. Not a flicker of joy, just mechanical, obedient hysteria. And then the conductor spoke. Open quote, "We do not fake what is real," the voice echoed. "We remove what is false." Close quote. Elias pulled back, heart pounding. One of the children collapsed. Another's laughter turned to choking, but the conductor did not stop them. Instead, he turned toward the mirror on the far wall, and for the first time, Elias saw the reflection. Not a stranger, but Reynard Dorsey, or what was left of him. A man preserved by obsession, aged but unmistakable. Skin pale, eyes distant, voice strong. He hadn't died in 1871. They had buried the name, not the man. Elias stumbled back, boots scuffing the floor. Silence. The laughter stopped. The door creaked open wider. A dozen heads turned toward him in perfect synchrony, and Dorsey's voice, colder now, floated through the chamber. "You're early, Elias." He stepped into the hallway, walking toward him like a surgeon between operations. "But that's all right. We've kept your place." Elias raised his revolver. Dorsey stopped, hands still at his sides. "You think this is still about you," he said. "It isn't." Dorsey smiled faintly. "It was never about the performance. It's about replication." The laughter wasn't the end. It was the seed. Behind him, the children began laughing again, softer this time, but not in sync, organically. Elias felt the floor sway beneath him. "You're teaching them to feel." "No," Dorsey said. "We're teaching them to abandon the need." He stepped back into the chamber, and the doors slowly began to close. A final word slipped through the gap. "Your curtain never fell, Elias. It simply rose on another act." Then the door sealed and the laughter continued. By the time Elias returned to the city, morning had broken, but it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like the aftermath of a final scene no one had agreed to witness. He stood on the platform at East Line Station for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving, coat dusted with the remnants of the Hearthwick crawl spaces. The streets were busy again. Newsboys shouted headlines that meant nothing. Horses clattered over brick, bells rang, life resumed. But Elias could still hear it. The laughter, not behind him. Inside. He didn't return home. He went to St. Agatha's Convalescent Institute, where Cecily Bain had been transferred under a private order signed by a physician Elias had never heard of. The staff greeted him with polite reserve, and though they claimed she was in recovery, it was clear from the moment he passed through the ward doors that Cecily wasn't recovering at all. She was adapting. He found her sitting by the window in a pale blue robe, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair had been combed. Her posture was perfect, but her eyes, they did not light up at the sight of him. "Cecily," he said gently. She turned toward him with a pleasant expression, as if greeting a stranger at a train station. "Good afternoon." "It's me," he said, stepping closer. "Elias." Her smile never faltered. "I'm sorry. That name doesn't ring any bells." His heart sank. "You don't remember me?" She looked away. "I've had a lot of thoughts removed. They said it was best." "Who said that?" She hesitated. Then slowly she looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "The conductor." Elias sat heavily beside her. "What did they do to you?" Cecily blinked. "They helped me forget the noise, the useless sadness, the effort of pretending." She touched her cheek as if adjusting an invisible mask. "I don't have to act anymore." Tears burned in Elias's eyes. "You weren't acting. You were surviving." She shook her head gently. "No, I was clinging to roles I never auditioned for. Wife, widow, victim. But now I'm part of the audience, and the audience doesn't suffer. It observes." The way she said it chilled him more than any scream. Before he could reply, a nurse arrived. "Time for her treatment," she said briskly. Elias tried to protest, but Cecily had already turned away, following the nurse as obediently as a child heading to a piano lesson. He stood alone in the hallway. Outside her room, he noticed something taped to the wall, a poster, elegant but faded. A new repertory season coming soon for those willing to listen. The image beneath the text was of a stage curtain just beginning to rise. He left the institute in silence, but his next stop was anything but quiet. He stormed into the municipal records office, demanding all documentation on Hearthwick House, its leases, its medical licenses, its history. What he got was a blank stare and a short reply. Hearthwick House was torn down in 1873. He blinked. "That's impossible." The clerk shrugged. "There's no standing structure registered under that name or address." Elias slammed down the photograph from the Atbridge Theater. "I was there 2 nights ago, and this man Dorsey, he's alive." The clerk looked at the photograph carefully, then nodded slowly. "That's a good piece of work," he said. "Very theatrical." "What do you mean?" The man flipped the photo over. "It's stamped. Look in the corner." There was a circular black mark, property of the Society of Joy, dramatic division, archival reproduction only. Elias staggered back. The photo hadn't been taken. It had been distributed. He'd been given a copy of his own memory, carefully edited and cataloged like a prop returned to wardrobe. The file drawer behind the clerk slid shut, and Elias finally understood. This wasn't a performance meant to end. This was a system, a repeating loop, a mechanism built not to kill, but to reshape. And the conductor wasn't just one man anymore. It was an institution. The night that followed brought no sleep. Elias sat alone at his kitchen table, the gaslight hissing low above him, the city beyond his window humming with a life that now felt entirely artificial. His revolver rested beside a stack of old case files, names of victims that were no longer dead, suspects that were no longer guilty, timelines bent to the will of those who had rewritten reality as if it were merely a faulty script. The Society of Joy didn't need to kill anymore. It only needed to rewrite, and it was doing it well. Cecily's vacant smile, the vanished records of Hearthwick House, the photograph stamped as a dramatic reproduction, and now even the memory of the Palmerstone Society's downfall seemed to shift. No longer an exposure, but perhaps just another act. He had one chance left: the City Medical Library. Located beneath the east wing of the University Hospital, the library's lower archives had been sealed for decades, officially due to fire damage. But Elias had always suspected it was bureaucratic shorthand for material too dangerous to bury and too scandalous to release. He knew the night guard, and more importantly, he knew where the old blueprints were kept. Just after midnight, Elias slipped into the back service entrance using an old inspector's badge no one had revoked. The building smelled of disinfectant and mold, and the flickering lights cast long institutional shadows across the tile. He descended 2 flights of stairs to the restricted subarchives. The lock was rusted, the door swollen from time, but after several tries, it gave. Inside were shelves of yellow documents, wax-sealed boxes, and ancient film reels curled like sleeping serpents. He searched, and what he found should not have existed. Experiential recordings. S.J. stamped 1869 through 1885. S.J. Society of Joy. He opened one box and found a series of labeled vials long since dried, but still bearing the names of known compounds. Euphorotine, lacramine, vasodrine. Some were crossed out, others annotated in handwritten scroll. Unstable memory contamination risk. Beneath the vials, a stack of thin photographic plates, each etched with a face frozen in laughter. Real laughter, not posed, not framed, not human. Elias turned them over. Each plate had initials, some familiar, and one S.K., Silas Kettering. But the year 1869, that was impossible. Kettering hadn't even been born then, had he? Elias reached for a reel labeled simply Rehearsal 1. He threaded it onto the antique projector in the corner, cranked the handle, and watched. The room flickered with light. The film was grainy, silent, but the image was unmistakable. A man seated in a chair, center stage, lights above, figures in the shadows, the same chair from the Attlebridge Theater, the same stage dressing. The man in the chair began to laugh, not performatively, violently, uncontrollably, and then suddenly he went still, but the shadows applauded. Cut to another scene. This time the same chair, a different man. Elias stared at his face. It was his own, younger, barely 30. He fumbled with the projector, rewound the reel. No doubt he had been filmed, used, looped, and just as the realization took hold, the light behind him changed. He turned. The mirror in the corner of the archive, one he hadn't noticed before, was now illuminated, and in it he saw himself, sitting exactly where he was, except his face was wrong, smiling, watching, as if the Elias in the mirror had been there all along, waiting for the real one to remember. Then a voice spoke from the mirror, calm, even. "Now you're ready." Elias backed away, but the mirror shifted, pulling inward, opening like a door that hadn't been opened in a century. Behind it, stairs, stone, narrow, leading down, no lights, just the sound of laughter. Far below, dozens of voices, children, women, men, all in unison. And something else. the slow, steady beat of a conductor's baton tapping on wood. Then a voice he hadn't heard since the stage. "We needed you to remember, Elias, because we need you to finish what we started." The steps were older than the library above them, carved into stone long before electric light, long before municipal records, perhaps even long before anyone realized that a chair and a mirror could be more dangerous than a weapon. Elias descended without lantern. He didn't need one. The glow below, pale blue, soft as theater footlights, led him onward like a cue. As he moved deeper, the air changed, thicker, sweeter, familiar. That same scent, the one he had chased for months, wrapped around him like an old memory. Violets, copper, ink. At the bottom of the stairs, like he entered a long corridor lined with what looked like confessionals, each marked with a different number. Some were closed, some open. Inside them, chairs, small mirrors, speakers built into the walls, rehearsal booths. This wasn't an archive, it was a training ground. He passed booth after booth, hearing faint laughter behind some doors, weeping behind others. Monotone voice drills, repeating lines over and over. Emotion is a habit. We correct habits. Emotion is a mask. We remove masks, and then he found the central chamber. It was a theater underground, circular seats arranged like an ancient coliseum, all facing a single raised stage. On it stood a chair, a mirror, and a man, Reynard Dorsey, older now than any man had a right to be, but standing tall, face half-lit, gloved hands resting on the conductor's podium. "You came," Dorsey said without turning. Elias stepped forward. There was nowhere else left to go. Dorsey gestured to the seat. "You've already sat here once." "I remember." "And yet," Dorsey continued, "you returned. That's what makes you perfect." "For what?" Elias asked. "To finish the process," he said. Kitaring believed emotion had to be stripped away, but he was small-minded. He wanted purity. I want multiplicity. He turned then, and Elias saw that his eyes were no longer eyes. They were mirrors reflecting only whoever stood before him. "We don't erase feeling," Dorsey said. "We duplicate it, curate it, catalog it, share it." He pointed to the hundreds of seats above where rows of figures now sat watching. Men and women, children, elders, all silent, all smiling. Faces Elias recognized, some alive, some dead, some his own, over and over. "You were never meant to investigate," Dorsey said. "You were meant to be replicated." Elias looked at the mirror beside the chair, and he saw himself already seated, smiling, perfectly still, a copy. Dorsey held out a vial. The final formula, not for euphoria, not for dread, but for eraser. "Take it," Dorsey said, "and we will archive the final version, the version that chose us." Elias stepped forward, then paused. He stared at the vial, at the mirror, at the audience who had not blinked once. He looked back at Dorsey and smiled. Then he laughed. Not softly, not politely, not from madness, but from something real. A crack in the script. Dorsey's smile faltered. "You're not following the scene." "No," Elias said. "I'm writing a new one." He turned, pulled the flask from his coat, the one he'd filled earlier with the corrupted compound from the archives, and smashed it at the conductor's feet. The vapor exploded into the air, twisting instantly into the lights above. Dorsey gasped, his face contorting, not with joy, not with fear, but with raw confusion. The audience began to stir, not in unison, not on cue, one by one, turning to each other, looking at their own hands, their own expressions. Someone cried, someone stood and began laughing out of rhythm. The system broke, and Elias ran. He ran through the corridor, past the booths, up the stairs, the sound of shattering mirrors behind him echoing like distant gunfire. By the time he burst into the main library, the fire alarms had been triggered, though no one could say why. There were no flames, only light. Too much light. Days later, the story made it into the papers, but barely. A gas leak, a minor explosion in the university basement. No casualties, no suspects. The lower archives were sealed again, and Harthwick House gone, truly gone. Elias Merton was placed on leave, then quietly retired. Some say he vanished. Some say he still lives, walking the streets of New Avalon in a long coat, ducking beneath awnings, watching for flickering curtains and forgotten theaters. But others, those who know, they say he became the last unscripted man, the only one who remembered he was being watched. And as for you, the lights are dimming now, the curtain's about to fall. But before it does, take a moment. Think back to the last time you laughed. Did it feel natural? Did it belong to you? Or were you just reading your